Hey everybody, this is the introduction to a book by Matthias Küntzel titled Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism in the Middle East, the 1948 Arab War against Israel and the Aftershocks of World War II. I'm going to read all the stuff in the beginning as well. So this book's from 2024. It's got a foreword by Jeffrey Herf. Introduction headings include Islamic Antisemitism, New Debates in the Arab World, New Debates in the USA, ? My Approach. Chapter 1, Islamic Antisemitism. Headings: Islamic Anti-Judaism, European Antisemitism, Sayyid Qutb's, quote, Our Struggle with the Jews, end quote, The Charter of Hamas, quote, Al-Aqsa in Danger, end quote. Chapter 2, 1937, The Watershed. Terror Against the Partition Plan. Berlin Steps In. Quote, Islam and Judaism, end quote. The Blodon Congress. Was it the Mufti, ? Prophecies of the Final Battle. Chapter 3, 1939 to 1945, Goebbels in Arabic. Headings: The Season Shortwave Radio Station, In Muslim Garb, Jew Hatred by Radio, The Call to Pogrom, Farhud, The Massacre of Iraqi Jews. What was the impact of the radio propaganda? Excursus, The Nazis in Iran. Chapter 4, 1948, Arab-Israeli War. Headings: The Muslim Brotherhood and the Mufti. The First Middle East War. Qualms of the Arab League. Anti-Semitic mobilization. Aftershock of National Socialism. Israel's guilt? ? Chapter 5, In the Name of Islam. Headings: What do you think of Adolf Hitler? ? Active Arrogance. How to Combat Islamic Antisemitism? ? Ankara and Tehran. Epilogue. And finally, there's a document. Appeal of the Grand Mufti to the Islamic World in 1937. I'm going to read the foreword. Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism, and the Middle East makes available to English readers Küntzel's 1990 work, Nazis und der Nahe Osten, wie der islamische Antisemitismus entstand, Nazis and the Middle East, How Islamic Antisemitism Emerged, a work that examined the intertwining and the anti-Semitic after-effects of Nazism and Islamism. Though it emerged from the intellectual and scholarly climate in Germany in recent decades, its arguments are of direct relevance to discussions of these issues in Britain and the English-speaking world in general. Nazis' Islamic anti-Semitism in the Middle East offers a bold and compelling interpretation of the origins of the Arab-Israel War of 1948 that challenges a great deal of liberal and certainly left conventional wisdom. It offers essential historical background to the study of contemporary antisemitism. Matthias Küntzel is a leading figure among liberals in Germany who have examined the historical connections between Nazi Germany and Islamist ideologies and organizations during World War II and the Holocaust, as well as their political after-effects in the immediate post-war years. In that context, the German political tradition of frank reckoning with crimes of the Nazi past, including the Holocaust, includes scholars and writers who examine contemporary antisemitism in all its three variations on the right and on the left from the Islamists. Examine contemporary anti-Semitism in all of its three variations on the right on the left and from Islamists. In 2003, Ka-Ira, a small left-liberal publisher in Freiburg, Germany, published Matthias Küntzel's Jihad und Judenhass über die neuen antijüdischen Krieg, Jihad and Jew hatred on the new anti-Jewish war. That description of Ka-Ira Verlag is not true. Ka-Ira Verlag is not liberal at all. It publishes, for instance, Marx's Capital, the collected works of Alfred Sohn Reitel, Roman Rozdalski. It has a piece by Maximilian Rubel, Marx theorist of anarchism, and the collected works of Johannes Agnoli, who was 100% not a liberal, but a libertarian communist of sorts, or just a libertarian communist. Ira Verlag is associated with anti-Deutsche politics, but that is but they are a radical left publishing house. In that work, Küntzel traced the ideological lineage of the Al-Qaeda terrorists of the 9/11 attacks from the Arab collaborators with Nazi Germany, the Muslim Brotherhood from the 1940s to the 1960s, to the Hamas Charter of 1988, and then to Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. In 2007, Telos Press in the United States published a revised and expanded English translation entitled Jihad and Jew Hatred, Islamism, Nazism, and the Roots of 9/11. As I was working on the anti-Jewish propaganda of the Nazi regime and shared Küntzel's views of the reactionary character of Islamist ideology, I agreed to write the foreword to the American edition. Jihad and Jew Hatred was one of the most important works published in Europe and the United States that examined Islamism and terror in the decade following the 9/11 attacks. Nazis, Islamic Antisemitism, and the Middle East examines how the Nazis could anchor Islamist anti-Semitism in the Arab world, and how the image of the Jews in Islam changed under the influence of Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda. Islamism emerged as a distinctive interpretation of the religion of Islam, evident in key texts by Haj Amin al-Husseini, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Hassan al-Banna, I think he was like the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, and Sayyid Qutb, who is like the leading ideological writer of the Muslim Brotherhood. The result was to justify, quote, a religious war, end quote, which fostered a cult of martyrdom, fanaticism, and justification of terror aimed at the Jews. Anti-Semitism in the Arab societies was not primarily a response to the establishment of the State of Israel. Rather, quote, administration for Hitler and Rommel and hatred of the Jews was strong before Israel. Rather, quote, admiration for Hitler and Rommel and hatred of the Jews was strong before Israel was established. After 1945, the Arab area was the only region of the world in which a pro-national socialist past was a source of pride, not shame, end quote. One of Küntzel's key arguments is that the reason for that anomaly was not the establishment of Israel, but, quote, the influence of the Nazis on events in the Middle East between 1937 and 1948, and the impact of years of anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda in the Arabic language, ... Only when we understand how strong modern Middle Eastern history was influenced by the after effects, Nachwirkungen, of National Socialism, will we be able to properly understand and adequately counter Jew hatred, Judenhass, in this region and its echo among Muslims in Europe, end quote. Küntzel. Nazis, Islamic anti-Semitism in the Middle East attributes agency to the Arabs, in particular to Haj Amin al-Husseini, and Haj Amina Husseini's text of 1937, Islam and the Jews. Küntzel calls it, quote, the founding document of Islamic anti-Semitism, end quote. One that presented, quote, the first comprehensive statement that constructed a continuous line connecting Muhammad's confrontation with the Jews in Medina and the contemporary conflict in Palestine that linked the 7th to the 20th century, end quote. Husseini contributed to transforming, quote, a limited and secular conflict over Palestinian territory into an unlimited religious war that was a matter of life and death, end quote, at whose core was an antagonism to the Jews, which Husseini claimed was at the core of Islam. Part of the historical import of the article, or the piece, Islam and the Jews by Haj Amina Husseini, was that Husseini wrote Islam and the Jews 4 years before Husseini went to Berlin in 1941 and began Husseini's most intense collaboration with Nazi Germany, and 11 years before the State of Israel was founded in 1948. Küntzel draws attention to this temporal sequence to reject the argument that post-war anti-Semitism The post-war anti-Semitism in the Middle East was a consequence of Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel. Küntzel argues that, quote, this early moment in time suggests that it was not the later intensification of the Middle East conflict that fostered anti-Semitism. Rather, it was the anti-Semitism that was previously fanned and inflamed, bracket, in 1937, in bracket, that produced the subsequent conflict with its intensification, end quote. Küntzel. In other words, Islamic anti-Semitism was not the result of Zionist goals before 1948 or of the actions of the State of Israel during the War of 1948 and after. Rather, it was the cause first of the rejection of the compromise partition plans and then of the war itself. Küntzel interprets the War of 1948 as a, quote, aftershock of National Socialism, end quote. Küntzel. The 1948 war took place, quote, because Nazi Germany's anti-Semitic Arab language propaganda shaped the political climate of the post-war years, and because in this heated climate no one was able to put limits on the politics of the Mufti and of the Muslim Brotherhood, end quote. Küntzel. The Arab War against Israel of 1948 was, quote, a kind of aftershock of the previous Nazi war against the Jews. Amin al-Husseini, the Mufti of Jerusalem, embodied the continuity between both events, end quote. Küntzel. Küntzel concludes that fighting anti-Semitism today requires a rethinking of the Israeli-Arab-Palestinian conflict. Quote, if it is the case that Nazi propaganda made an important contribution to anti-Semitism in the Arab world, then our view of the Middle East conflict needs to change. It is not Israel's settlement blocks, but rather the Palestinian ideological blockade that constitutes the biggest barrier to peaceful arrangements. The Jew hatred in this region must no longer be played down as a kind of local custom. For when we are looking at the anti-Semitic manifestations that take place from the Middle East to Europe, we are looking directly at the face of our own past, end quote. Küntzel. Küntzel's argument thus asserts that the meaning of coming to terms with the Nazi past includes understanding the causal importance that Nazism had for fostering and strengthening anti-Semitism in the Middle East. The arguments and evidence in Nazis' Islamic anti-Semitism in the Middle East recalls the years immediately following the Holocaust when liberals and leftists in the late 1940s, in Britain, Western Europe, and the United States all viewed the Zionist project as a continuation of World War II anti-Nazism. The Soviet Union also supported the Zionists with a mixture of shared wartime anti-fascism and hopes of driving the, quote, Western imperialist, end quote, out of the Middle East. With the benefit of decades of published research and his own original work in the archives, Küntzel can offer a deeper understanding of Islamic anti-Semitism than was possible at the time. To those liberals and leftists who have not followed the scholarship of recent decades, Nazis' Islamic anti-Semitism in the Middle East will indeed come as a bit of a shock, but is a necessary and long overdue jolt to conventional wisdom. It comprises an original and, again, path-breaking contribution to the scholarship and intellectual discussion of the origins, nature, and consequences of both the indigenous and international sources of Islamic anti-Semitism from 1937 to the present. It is most welcome that it should appear in a series sponsored by the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. Tragically, the not-so-very-distant past is apparent in strains Tragically, the not-so-very-distant past is apparent in strains of contemporary anti-Semitism. The English editor comprises valuable contributions. The English edition comprises a valuable contribution both to scholarship and to public discussion. Jeffrey Herf, University of Maryland, College Park, December 2022. So that's the foreword. And this is the actual introduction. According to my Webster's New World Dictionary, a quote aftershock is quote a minor earthquake that follows a larger earthquake and originates at or near the same place, end quote. In this book, I refer to the 1948 Arab War against Israel as an aftershock. Here I show for the first time how that quote minor end quote war was connected to the quote larger Nazi war against the Jews that ended in 1945. The central role of Nazi anti-Semitism in the planning and implementation of the Shoah is well known. The impact of that same Nazi anti-Semitism on the Middle East, on the other hand, remains gravely under-researched. My book aims to fill this gap to the extent currently possible. It sets forth the methods used by Nazi Germany from 1937 onwards to disseminate its anti-Semitism in the Middle East, in the Arabic language, and the role that this anti-Semitism would play 11 years later, when the Arab armies fell upon the newly founded Jewish state of Israel. This fateful war triggered the refugee catastrophe that has marked the Middle East conflict ever since. I am not the only person to have noticed the similarities between Middle Eastern anti-Semitism and that of the Nazis. Thus, 30 years ago, Bernard Lewis, the doyen of Middle East research, stated that, quote, since 1945, certain Arab countries have been the only places in the world where hardcore Nazi-style anti-Semitism is publicly and officially endorsed and propagated, end quote. One second. Footnote. See the article by Bernard Lewis, The Arab World Discovers Anti-Semitism, published in Sander L. Gilman and Stephen T. Katz's edited volume, Anti-Semitism in Times of Crises, published in 1991. End footnote. Bernard Lewis's finding has subsequently been confirmed by many studies detailing the denial or even justification of the Holocaust in this part of the world. The striking similarities between Arab anti-Jewish caricatures and those of the Nazis, the many Arabic editions of Hitler's Mein Kampf, and the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and the pro-Hitler sentiments of Arab youth. There's a number of footnotes here. Footnote, see Mir Litvak and Esther Webman's book, From Empathy to Denial, Arab Responses to the Holocaust. The description for this book says, based on years of research conducted mostly in Arabic sources, Mir Litvak and Esther Webman traced the evolution of post-World War II perceptions of the Holocaust and their parallel emergence in the wake of the Arab-Israeli conflict of 1948, following the establishment of the State of Israel Arab attitudes toward the Holocaust became entangled with broader anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic sentiments. Litvak and Webman tracked this discourse through the work of leading intellectuals and turned to representations of the Holocaust in the media and culture of Egypt, Lebanon, Jordan, and among the Palestinian people. Their chronological history, which spans 60 years, provides a remarkable perspective on the origins, development, and tenaciousness of anti-Holocaust belief. Back to the text and footnote. Footnote, Aryeh Shtav, Peace, the Arabian Caricature, a study of anti-Semitic imagery. The description for Peace, the Arabian Caricature of Anti-Semitic Imagery. Peace, the Arabian Caricature, a study of anti-Semitic imagery. Doesn't seem to be a good description for this. I'll just read this description from Amazon. In his new book, Peace, the Arabian Caricature, Aryeh Shtav examines the anti-Semitic caricatures and illustrations of the medieval Christian church, the Nazis, and especially the modern Arab world's graphic anti-Jewish and anti-Israel depictions. Shtav explains that although, quote, caricature as a graphical depiction goes back to the dawn of drawing, anti-Semitic caricature is the only type that derives its contents from a unique and disturbing synthesis of theological, moral, racial, social, and political negation. It is not directed at individuals, but rather at the entire Jewish people, end quote. Aryeh Shtav. Put bluntly, quote, anti-Semitic caricature, like the yellow patch, is intended to attach the mark of Cain on the brow of the Jews, end quote. Though the images in Stav's book do not tell the whole story, they do paint a grisly picture of Arab attitudes towards peace with Israel. What should the Israeli response be? The answer, like the outcome of the peace process, is unclear. Aryeh Shtav is the director of the Ariel Center for Policy Research in Tel Aviv, a nonpartisan organization devoted to inclusive research and discussion of political and strategic issues concerning Israel and the Jewish people. Shtav is also the editor of Netiv, a bi-monthly periodical on politics and the arts. Back to the text and footnote. An article by Bahraini writer. Quote, I was shocked to discover how many young Arabs idolize Adolf Hitler, end quote. Published in MEMRI, Special Dispatch of November, Special Dispatch number 6624, 22nd of September 2016. Back to the text and footnote. At the same time, however, this, quote, hardcore Nazi-style anti-Semitism, end quote, is usually attributed to a single cause, Zionism and Israel's role in the region. This argument is first methodologically false. One of the main results of anti-Semitism research is the understanding that anti-Semitism does not originate with the Jews, so that reference back to alleged Jewish behavior cannot explain it. Second, however reprehensible Israel's behavior might conceivably be, it can neither explain nor justify the glorification of National Socialism. Third, only in recent years has the significance of the Nazis' Arabic language propaganda as a means for exerting influence in the Arab world been brought to light, notably through the pioneering work of Jeffrey Herf. In 2009, Herf introduced us to the content of the manuscripts of the Nazis' Arabic language broadcasts in his book, Nazi propaganda for the Arab world. 5 years later, David Motadel published further important findings in his study, Islam in Nazi Germany. The description of this book says, this groundbreaking history connects Nazi Germany's Arabic language propaganda during World War II to anti-Semitism in the Middle East in the decades since. Jeffrey Herf, a leading scholar in the field, offers the most extensive examination to date of Nazi propaganda activities targeting Arabs and Muslims in the Middle East during World War II and the Holocaust. Herf draws extensively on previously unused and little-known archival resources, including the shocking transcription of the, quote, Axis broadcast in Arabic, end quote, radio programs which convey a strongly anti-Semitic message. Herf explores the intellectual, political, and cultural context in which German and European radical anti-Semitism was found to resonate with similar views rooted in selective appropriation of the traditions of Islam. Pro-Nazi Arab exiles in wartime Berlin, including Haj al-Husseini and Rashid al-Kilani, collaborated with the Nazis in constructing their Middle East propaganda campaign. By integrating the political and military history of the war in the Middle East with the intellectual and cultural dimensions of the propagandistic diffusion of Nazi ideology, Herf offers the most thorough examination to date of this important chapter in the history of World War II. Importantly, he also shows how the anti-Semitism promoted by the Nazi propaganda effort contributed to the anti-Semitism exhibited by adherents of radical forms of Islam in the Middle East today. Back to the text. And David Motadel's book, Islam and Nazi Germany's War. In this book, the description says, come on. In the most crucial phase of the Second World War, German troops, fighting in regions as far apart as the Sahara and the Caucasus, confronted the Allies across lands largely populated by Muslims. Nazi officials saw Islam as a powerful force with the same enemies as Germany, the British Empire, the Soviet Union, the Jews. Islam in Nazi Germany's war is the first comprehensive account of Berlin's remarkably ambitious attempt to build an alliance with the Islamic world. Drawing on archival research in 3 continents, David Motadel explains how German officials tried to promote the Third Reich as a patron of Islam. Motadel explores Berlin's policies and propaganda in the Muslim war zones and the extensive work that authorities undertook for the recruitment, spiritual care, and ideological indoctrination of tens of thousands of Muslim volunteers who fought in the Wehrmacht and the SS. Islam in Nazi Germany's war reveals how German troops on the ground in North Africa, the Balkans, and the Eastern Front engaged with diverse Muslim populations, including Muslim Roma and Jewish converts to Islam. Combining measured argument with a masterly handling of detail, it illuminates the profound impact of the Second World War on Muslims around the world and provides a new understanding of the politics of religion in the bloodiest conflict of the 20th century. Okay. Back to the text. Building on these studies, the current book shows that it was the Nazis themselves who initially brought genocidal anti-Semitism to the Arab world. At the same time, the current book presents a series of new facts that have the potential to change your view of the past and present of the Middle East conflict. First of all, I set out what is currently known about the origin and dissemination of the pamphlet Judaism and Islam, which was first published in 1937 in Cairo. It is a shocking text that uses religion for the sole purpose of inciting Jew hatred. The Nazis distributed large numbers of copies of this text in several languages in Muslim-inhabited regions. A translation of the German version published in 1938 in Berlin appears as an appendix to this book. This piece is significant because it represents the first attempt to link the Jew hatred of early Islam to Christian-inspired anti-Semitism of European origin, and thus create a new expression of Jew hatred, Islamic Antisemitism. The very date of its publication and dissemination, 11 years before the foundation of Israel, and 30 years before Israel's assumption of control in Gaza and the West Bank, is revealing since it shows genocidal Jew hatred to be a cause, not a consequence of later crises in the Middle East conflict. Second, I present new archival discoveries relating to the collaboration between German Nazi agents and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, activity in which Goebbels took a close personal interest. In 1938 to 1939, the focus of this collaboration was Palestine. The Nazi operation paid off after 1945, when that very same Muslim Brotherhood, now grown into a mass movement, pushed the Arab rulers into war against Israel. Third, I analyzed, building on the previously mentioned study by Jeffrey Herf, the nature and impact of the Nazis' Arabic language radio propaganda broadcasts that disseminated and exacerbated Jew hatred in this part of the world between 1939 and 1945. One of the consequences of this propaganda was that by 1947, large swaths of the Arab public viewed a Jewish state as a mortal threat that had to be violently destroyed. Fourth, I described the measures taken by the Nazis in 1944 to 1945 to prepare for the forthcoming war against Israel. With their own defeat looming, they wished to preserve their anti-Semitic legacy by taking steps to prevent the future establishment of a Jewish state. Fifth, I, for the first time, substantiate in detail my assumption that the Nazis' anti-Semitic propaganda was one of the decisive factors that led to the Arab states going to war against Israel in May 1948. I show that there is an ideological link between the Nazi war against the Jews and the Arab war against Israel 3 years later, so that the latter can be interpreted as a kind of aftershock of the great catastrophe of 1939 to 1945. With this thesis, I break new ground. I am well aware that my interpretation does not amount to a definitive judgment and that the topic requires further research, in particular by scholars who read Arabic. My book lays a particular emphasis on the years 1937 and 1947. In 1937, the British Peel Commission brought forward the proposal for a two-state solution for Palestine. One second. The Wikipedia for the Peel Commission says, the Peel Commission, formerly known as the Palestine Royal Commission, was a British Royal Commission of Inquiry headed by Lord Peel, appointed in 1936 to investigate the cause of conflict in Mandatory Palestine, which was administered by the United Kingdom following a 6-month-long Arab general strike. On the 7th of July 1937, the Commission published a report that, for the first time, stated that the League of Nations mandate had become unworkable and recommended partition. The British cabinet endorsed the partition plan in principle but requested more information. Following the publication in 1938, the Woodhead Commission was appointed to examine it in detail and recommend an actual partition plan. The Arab leadership opposed the partition plan. The Arab Higher Committee opposed the idea of a Jewish state and called for an independent state of Palestine, quote, with protection of all legitimate Jewish and other minority rights and safeguarding a reasonable British interest, end quote. They also demanded cessation of all Jewish immigration and land purchase. They argued that the creation of a Jewish state and lack of independent Palestine was a betrayal of the word given by Britain. The Zionist leadership was bitterly divided over the plan. In a resolution adopted at the 37th Zionist Congress, the delegates rejected the specific partition plan. Yet the principle of partition is generally thought to have been, quote, accepted, or, quote, not rejected outright by any major faction. The delegates empowered the leadership to pursue further negotiations. The Jewish Agency Council later attached a request that a conference be convened to explore a peaceful settlement in terms of an undivided Palestine. According to Benny Morris, Ben-Gurion and Weizmann saw it, quote, as a stepping stone to some further expansion and eventual takeover of the whole of Palestine, end quote. Back to the text. In 1947, a resolution setting out a two-state plan for Palestine was adopted by the General Assembly of the United Nations by a two-thirds majority and with the support of both the United States and the Soviet Union. Moreover, on both occasions, there were Arabs who favored the path of moderation and compromise. Why then did both efforts at compromise fail? The answer is of the greatest contemporary relevance at a time when the, quote, Abraham Accords, end quote, of 2020, peace agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, have offered a new prospect of compromise between Jewish and Arab interests. Wikipedia says, the Abraham Accords are bilateral agreements on Arab-Israeli normalization signed between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and between Israel and Bahrain on September 15, 2020, mediated by the United States. The announcement of August 13, 2020 concerned Israel and the Emirates before the subsequent announcement of an agreement between Israel and Bahrain on the 11th of September 2020. On September 15, 2020, the signing of the agreement was hosted by U.S. President Donald Trump on the Truman balcony of the White House amid elaborate staging intended to evoke the signings of historic formal peace treaties in prior administrations. As part of the two agreements, both Emirates and Bahrain recognized Israel's sovereignty, enabling the establishment of full diplomatic relations. Israel's initial agreement with the Emirates marked the first instance of Israel establishing diplomatic relations with an Arab country since 1994, when the Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty came into effect. The agreements were named, quote, the Abraham Accords, to highlight the common belief of Judaism and Islam in the prophet Abraham. On the 23rd of October 2020, Israel and Sudan agreed to normalize ties. The agreement is unratified as of 2024. As part of the agreement, the U.S. removed Sudan from its list of state sponsors of terrorism and gave them a $1.2 billion loan. On the 6th of January 2021, the government of Sudan signed the Abraham Accords Declaration in Khartoum. On December 22, 2020, the Israel-Morocco Normalization Agreement was signed. In exchange for Morocco's recognition of Israeli sovereignty, the United States recognized Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara. Back to the text. In 1937, in order to defeat the Peel Commission proposal, the pseudo-religious pamphlet Judaism and Islam was conceived. In 1947, in order to block the implementation of the UN decision, Zionism was denounced as an alleged, quote, danger to all the Islamic nations, end quote. In subsequent years, an Islamized anti-Semitism was repeatedly mobilized to block compromise and normalization. Today, the religion of Islam is again being used as an instrument to prevent reconciliation. Today, once more, the rulers of Ankara and Tehran, in Ramallah and Gaza, are resorting to their special interpretation of Islam in order to undermine the Abraham Accords. Quote, normalization means that you agree, to natural relations with the enemies of Prophet Muhammad, end quote. Mahmoud al-Habash, the Palestinian Authority's top Sharia judge, has threatened. While in May 2021, Hamas used the religious symbol of the Al-Aqsa Mosque to justify its attacks on Jerusalem and Israel. The declared aim of the hail of missiles was to torpedo the cautious process of reconciliation between Israel and the Arab world currently underway. Whether with the Abraham Accords, the forces of peace will finally prevail, is in no way certain, but it is certainly a hope. I'm assuming this book was written before. Maybe it wasn't, but it was written before October 7th. I'm looking for Mahmoud Habash. Mahmoud al-Habash is Mahmoud Abbas's advisor on religious and Islamic affairs. He is also the Palestinian Authority's top Sharia judge. Al-Habash was previously Minister of Awqaf and Religious Affairs between 2009 and 2014, excuse me. On Wikipedia on the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Aqsa Mosque, also known as the Qibli Mosque or Qibli Chapel, is the main congregational mosque of prayer hall in the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound in the old city of Jerusalem. In some sources, the building is also named Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa, but this name primarily applies to the whole compound in which the building sits, which is itself also known as, quote, Al-Aqsa Mosque, unquote. The wider compound is known as Al-Aqsa, or Al-Aqsa Mosque Compound, also known as Al-Haram Al-Sharif. The reign of the Caliph Muawiyah I of the Umayyad Caliphate, founded in 661 AD, a quadrangular mosque for a capacity of 3,000 worshippers is recorded somewhere on the Haram Ash-Sharif. The present-day mosque, located on the south wall of the compound, was originally built by the 5th Umayyad Caliph, Abd al-Malik, who lived from 685 to 705, or his successor, Al-Walid I, 705 to 715, were both as a congregational mosque on the same axis of the Dome of the Rock, a commemorative Islamic monument. According to Islamic tradition, a small prayer hall, Musalla, would later become the Al-Aqsa Mosque, was built by Umar, the second caliph of the Rashidun Caliphate. After being destroyed in an earthquake in 746, the mosque was rebuilt in 758 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur. It was further expanded upon in 780 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mahdi, after which it consisted of 15 aisles and a central dome. However, it was again destroyed during the 1033 Jordan Rift Valley earthquake. The mosque was rebuilt by the Fatimid Caliph al-Zahir between 1021 and 1036, who reduced it to 7 aisles but adorned its interior with an elaborate central archway covered in vegetable mosaics. The current structure preserves the 11th century outline. During the periodic renovations undertaken, the ruling Islamic dynasties constructed additions to the mosque and its precincts, such as its dome, facade, minarets, and minbar, and interior structure. Upon its capture by the Crusaders in 1099, the mosque was used as a palace. It was also the headquarters of the religious order of the Knights Templar. After the area was conquered by Saladin in 1187, the structure's function as a mosque was restored. More renovations, repairs, and expansion projects were undertaken in later centuries by the Ayyubids, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, the Supreme Muslim Council of British Palestine, and during the Jordanian rule of the West Bank. Since the beginning of the ongoing Israeli occupation of the West Bank, the mosque has remained under the independent administration of the Jerusalem Islamic Waqf. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing any of this shit right. New section. Islamic Antisemitism. A second hope that I place in this book is that of overcoming the resistance to discussion of the topic of Muslim antisemitism. Many observers prefer to avoid mention of anti-Semitism among Muslims out of fear of being labeled, quote, racist or, quote, Islamophobic. They feel, quote, motivated to deny the problem, to minimize the problem, to excuse the problem, to explain the problem away, and to attack or ridicule those who see the problem as important, end quote. Footnote, see Neil J. Kressel's book, quote, The Sons of Pigs and Apes, end quote. Muslim Anti-Semitism and the Conspiracy of Silence. The Sons of Pigs and Apes, end quote. Muslim Anti-Semitism and the Conspiracy of Silence. Neil J. Kressel holds a PhD in social psychology from Harvard University, is taught at Harvard, New York University, and elsewhere. Currently, Neil J. Kressel directs the honors program in the social sciences at William Patterson University. In 2008, he was visiting professor at the Yale Initiative for the Interdisciplinary Study of Antisemitism. Neil J. Kressel is the author of 4 previously published books, including Mass Hate, The Global Race of Genocide and Terror, revised and updated. He lives in northern New Jersey. The description of The Sons of Pigs and Apes says, from the 1950s to the 1990s, anti-Semitism everywhere seemed to be on the wane. But as Neil Kressel documents in this startling book, the Muslim world has resurrected in recent decades almost every diatribe that more than 2 millennia of European hostility produced against the Jews, and it has introduced many homegrown and novel modes of attack. Though it is impossible to determine precisely how many of the world's 1.2 billion Muslims hold anti-Jewish beliefs, Kressel finds that much bigotry comes from the highest levels of religious and political leadership. Compounding the problem, as Kressel demonstrates, many in the West refuse to recognize this issue. The growing epidemic of hate has been largely ignored, misunderstood, or downplayed. Kressel reveals because of apathy, ignorance, confusion, bigotry, ideology, purported pragmatism, and misguided multiculturalism. Those who value human rights ignore anti-Semitism at their own risk, he cautions, noting that no anti-Semitic regime or movement has ever been otherwise reasonable or progressive. Küntzel argues convincingly that Muslim anti-Semitism provides an acid test for the seriousness of Western liberalism. If the West fails to stem this growing tide, as now seems likely, future affairs will not go well for the true proponents of democracy. Küntzel moves beyond sounding the alarm to explore the diverse religious, political, social, and psychological forces that have created and nurtured the new hostility to Jews in the Muslim world. He concludes with a bold and clear plan for what must be done to confront this hostility. Back to the text and footnote. It is true that not only are there some people who try to whitewash Islam and deny any connection between Islam and Jew hatred, but also others who no less sweepingly wish to besmirch the name of Islam and make the religion the sole reason for Muslim anti-Semitism. I reject both generalizations. In dealing with this topic, careful distinctions, semantic and historic analysis, and a lack of ideological prejudice are all requirements. The book's first chapter, therefore, is devoted to establishing for the first time a precise definition of the term, quote, Islamic Antisemitism, end quote. In the final chapter, I return to this matter. Here I consider the intra-Islamic arguments regarding Jew hatred among Muslims, the role of Islamic anti-Semitism in Europe, and the question of how this hatred can be combated in Germany and beyond. New section. New debates in the Arab world. The ideas put forward in this book may help to provide an answer to a question now being posed by increasing members of people in the region as they contemplate Israel's successful development and the depressing conditions of many Arab societies. What went wrong? Thus, in Chapter 5, I document a series of statements from Arab sources that deal self-critically with their government's traditional rejectionist approach towards Israel. They lament the fact that in 1937 and 1947, possibilities for compromise were rejected, retrospectively declare the various Israel boycotts of recent decades to be mistaken, and examine the anti-Semitism and Israel hatred of the Arab world. Certain Arab media have also dealt with the destructive role of Haj Amin al-Husseini, the former Mufti of Jerusalem, and Haj Amin al-Husseini's alliances with the Nazis and the Islamist Muslim Brotherhood. Thus, in April 2019, a film festival in Ismailia in Egypt featured a documentary about the Nazi ties of the Muslim Brotherhood's founder, Hassan al-Banna. Then, in February 2020, the popular Saudi daily newspaper, Okaz, published a lengthy article entitled, quote, The Nazi Brotherhood, end quote, which dealt with the relations between Hitler, al-Husseini, and the Muslim Brotherhood. The cover picture showed Hassan al-Banna wearing a fez with a swastika on it. The new discussions about these connections are most welcome. However, the photo montage of al-Banna with the swastika reveals a propagandistic intent to damage a political opponent, in this case the Muslim Brotherhood, by using inaccurate accusations. While my book rejects such simplifications, I nonetheless hope that the incipient discussion of previous Arab mistakes will lead to an increased interest in verifiable historical facts. New section, Debates in the USA. It is my impression as an outside observer that anti-Zionist propaganda is making inroads in the USA. For example, when in February 2020, the renowned historian Deborah Lipstadt spoke on anti-Semitism at the University of California's Berkeley Law School, 3 young people displayed placards in protest. The first placard advocated BDS, and the second asserted that, quote, anti-Zionism, end quote, was not anti-Semitism, and the third referred to the 1948 Middle East wars in these terms, quote, the crimes of 1948, 800,000 refugees, 13,000 killed, 531 villages destroyed, 11 urban neighborhoods emptied, end quote. The 1948 war was, of course, a war in which not only Jews but also Arabs suffered terribly. The problem with the placard is that it stands historical reality on its head by holding Israel responsible for the war. The three young people seem ignorant of the fact that the Jewish side supported the UN partition resolution, while the Arab rulers not only rejected it but launched their war with the explicit aim of destroying Israel. Moreover, the protesters, who presumably belonged to the progressive part of American society, seem unaware that in 1948 the Soviet Union explicitly praised Israel for its pro-UN behavior and deemed the Arab world responsible for the outflow of refugees. The placard display followed an age-old anti-Semitic pattern in which historical facts are twisted as much as is necessary to make the Jews appear solely responsible for war and misery. The pattern was repeated during the Gaza War of May 2021. This time it was not some ignorant youths but the prestigious New York Times that shocked its readers with half-truths designed to channel their anger towards Israel. The Wikipedia for the 2021 Israel-Palestine crisis. The 2021 Israel-Palestine crisis, sometimes called the Unity Intifada, was a major outbreak of violence in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that mainly commenced on the 10th of May 2021 and continued until a ceasefire came into effect on the 21st of May. It was marked by protest and police riot control, rocket attacks on Israel by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Israeli airstrikes in the Gaza Strip. The crisis was triggered on the 6th of May when Palestinians in East Jerusalem began protesting over an anticipated decision in the Supreme Court of Israel on the eviction of 6 Palestinian families in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Under international law, the area, effectively annexed by Israel in 1980, is a part of the Israeli-occupied West Bank. On the 7th of May, according to Israel's Channel 12, Palestinians threw stones at Israeli police forces, who then stormed the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound using tear gas, rubber bullets, and stun grenades. The crisis prompted protests around the world as well as official reactions from world leaders. The violence coincided with Qadr Night, May 8th, observed by Muslims, and Jerusalem Day, 9th to 10th of May, an Israeli national holiday. The confrontations occurred ahead of a planned Jerusalem Day parade known as the Dance of Flags by far-right Jewish nationalists, which was later canceled. More than 600 people were injured, mostly Palestinians, drawing international condemnation. Israel's Supreme Court ruling on evictions from Sheikh Jarrah was then delayed for 30 days as Avichai Mandelblit, the erstwhile Attorney General of Israel, sought to reduce tensions. On the afternoon of the 10th of May, Hamas gave Israel an ultimatum to withdraw its security forces from both the Temple Mount complex and Sheikh Jarrah by 6 p.m. When the ultimatum expired without a response, both Hamas and the PIJ launched rockets from the Gaza Strip into Israel. Some of those rockets hit Israeli residences and a school. Israel then began a campaign of airstrikes against Gaza. Some 950 targets had been attacked, demolishing completely or partially 18 buildings, including 4 high-rise towers, 40 schools, and 4 hospitals, while also striking the Al-Shati refugee camp. Additionally, at least 19 medical facilities were damaged or destroyed by the Israeli bombardment. On the 17th of May, the United Nations estimated that Israeli airstrikes had destroyed 94 buildings in Gaza, comprising 461 housing and commercial units, including the Al-Jalal high-rise, housing offices of the Associated Press, the Al Jazeera Media Network, and other news outlets, and 60 condominiums. As a result of the violence, at least 256 Palestinians, including 66 children, were killed, including at least 7 from friendly fire. In Israel, at least 13 people were killed, including 2 children. The Gaza Ministry of Health reported that more than 1,900 Palestinians were injured, and as of 12th of May, at least 200 Israelis were reported to have been injured. Bracket needs update, end bracket. As of the 19th of May, at least 72,000 Palestinians have been displaced. Around 4,360 Palestinian rockets were fired towards Israel, of which 680 landed within the Gaza Strip. And over 90% of rockets bound towards populated areas were intercepted by Israel's Iron Dome. Israel conducted around 1,500 aerial, land, and sea strikes on the Gaza Strip. Calls for a ceasefire were first proposed on the 13th of May by Hamas, but were rejected by Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On the 18th of May, France, along with Egypt and Jordan, announced the filing of a United Nations Security Council resolution for a ceasefire. Egypt mediated a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas, which came into effect on the 21st of May 2021, ending 11 days of fighting in which both sides claimed victory. On the 16th of June 2021, incendiary balloons were launched from Gaza into Israel, which the Israeli Air Force responded to with multiple airstrikes in the Gaza Strip, resuming the fighting. Back to the text. This pattern was repeated during the Gaza War of May 2021. This time it was not ignorant use, but the prestigious New York Times that shocked its readers with half-truths designed to channel their anger towards Israel. On the 20th of May 2021, the Times published on its front page under the headline, quote, "They were just children," end quote, portraits of 64 children alleged to have been killed as a result of Israeli attacks on Gaza. The paper glossed over the fact that it was Hamas, the Palestinian branch of the Muslim Brotherhood, that had unleashed the latest war. In addition, there was not a word about the fact that Hamas deliberately places its launch pads in residential areas, abusing those living there as human shields whose sufferings can then be used to further whip up hatred against the Israeli, quote, child murderers, end quote. Instead of providing this crucial information, the influential paper played Hamas's game. It one-sidedly condemned Israel using a picture that lent itself to interpretation in terms of the venerable cliches about Jewish child murder. The book aims to correct such distortions of reality, for they are not without consequences. According to a poll conducted by the Anti-Defamation League in June 2021, 60% of American Jews surveyed have been subject to online and offline anti-Semitic attacks in the context of the May 2021 war. Over 3/4 expressed their growing concern over rising Jew hatred, and a similarly large majority called for stronger political countermeasures. It was not Israel or Zionism that provoked the May 2021 war, but the anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism of the Arab world. It is not Israel and Zionism that have created an exceptional state of affairs we have become accustomed to calling the Middle East conflict. The only exceptional thing that places the Jewish state in an exceptional situation is the 75-year-old anti-Zionist and Islamist call to destroy Israel. No other state in the world is confronted with this kind of campaign. At the source of this flood of hate lies the Nazis' desire to transform the political conflict over Palestine into an anti-Semitic war of life and death. They wanted to destroy not only the Jews, but any prospect of Jewish statehood. After 1945, the anti-Semitic part of Arab society, led by Amin al-Husseini and the Muslim Brotherhood, continued this war. They caused the Aftershock, the 1948 war, that further strengthened the, quote, hardcore Nazi-style anti-Semitism, end quote, and it continues to shape the Middle East conflict to this day. New section, my approach. My book is written from the point of view of a non-Jewish author who is interested in the effects of anti-Semitism on the development of the Middle Eastern conflict. The point of view implies a certain degree of partisanship. First, the study of Jew hatred and racism is never a neutral activity, but especially since 1945 has been bound up with the moral imperative of repressing and opposing anti-Jewish and racist sentiment. Second, my view of the Middle East conflict is not totally neutral. Anyone who has studied racism is therefore conscious of the sufferings of black people can scarcely fail to rejoice in the disappearance of apartheid in South Africa, whatever reservations they may have about South Africa's current policies. Applying the same position to Jew hatred means, because I study anti-Semitism, I am also conscious of Jewish suffering and cannot do otherwise than welcome the exercise of the Jewish right to self-determination and the resulting existence of a Jewish state, even though I may not always be pleased with Israeli government policies. Arab nationalists write about the Middle Eastern conflict in other terms. They view the Balfour Declaration of 1917 in which Britain promised, quote, the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, end quote, as a mistake. They criticized the fact that in 1922 the League of Nations, the predecessors of the United Nations, recognized not only the Balfour Declaration, but also a, quote, historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine, end quote. Both represented major victories for the Zionist movement due to both its negotiating skills and specific historical circumstances. In neither case were Palestine's Arabs consulted. To this extent, I can well understand and respect the alternative interpretation of the facts. I do not, however, feel the same about the accusation advanced by many Arab writers after 1945, the Arabs in Palestine were made to pay for the Nazis' Jewish policies, so for the sins of others, because the Palestinian Arabs too bear at least an indirect responsibility for the Holocaust. It was their anti-Zionist campaigns that caused Britain to restrict Jewish immigration to Palestine. Many Jews were murdered because they had no place to flee. By ensuring that the doors of Palestine were also closed to them, a large portion of the Arabs living in Palestine bore some responsibility for the impending tragedy. This book would not have come about without the help of Professor Alvin Rosenfeld, who has followed and supported my work for many years. I'd also like to express my profound gratitude to Indiana University's Institute for the Study of Contemporary Antisemitism, which Professor Rosenfeld leads, for financing the translation. Special thanks must also go to my colleague and friend of many years, Professor Jeffrey Herf. It provided me with a substantial selection of program manuscripts from Radio Season for the purposes of this book, and Dr. Eddie Cohen, who translated Arabic texts for me. There are many more colleagues and friends from different countries who have encouraged me in my work over the years and made it better through their findings and comments. Among them are Amir Barghisi, Yehuda Bauer, Ulrika Becker, I have a piece by her on this channel, Bastian Belder, Russell A. Berman, Pascal Bruckner, Catherine Chatterley, Ben Cohen, Irvin Kotler, R. Amy Elman, Hassan Altahar, Rolf Fader, Niram Ferretti, Martin Finkenberger, Joel Fishman, Monica Gudecka, Stefan Grigat, and again, Stefan Grigat wrote the piece, has a bunch of pieces on this channel, and he has books published with Ka'ir Verlag. But he also wrote, he comes from a radical left background. Mark Grimm, Gabby Gumbel, Friedhelm Hoffman, David Ibsen, Gunter Yekeli, Alan Johnson. Alan Johnson, I think, is like a social democrat now, but he comes out of the Third Camp Trotskyist Alliance for Workers' Liberty tradition originally. Leslie Clough, David Labude, Armin Langer, Mir Litvak, Florian Markle, Faryar Nickbacht, Nora Pester, Carl Pfeiffer, Mary Picone, Dina Parat, Yehoshua Porat, Doran Rabinovici, Alexander Ritzman, Shimon Samuels, Eric Sanders, Bualem Sansal, K. Schweigman Greva, Michael Spanny, Joseph F. Spurl, Pierre-Andre Teguieff, Bassam Tibi, Lawrence Weinbaum, Michael Wine, and Robert S. Wistrich, who sadly left us in 2015. Last but not least, I would like to thank my friend, Dr. Colin Mead, for his excellent translation, and my beloved wife, interlocutor and editor, Rosie Wittenhagen, whose unsparing criticism contributed so much to this work. And that's the end of the introduction to this book. I don't know how much of it I'm going to be reading, but I just wanted to read the introduction. Thank you so much for listening.